This week we're going to be focusing on the sleeve. Putting on the cuff, we've got the band in, putting on the cuff, making the pleats, sewing up the seam, and setting the sleeve into the body of the garment. So we're going to be working pretty much on the lower part first. So we will start by putting in the pleats. So always remember when you make a shirt that the bigger part, almost 75% of the shirt, that's going to represent the top of the arm. So with the cuff, that means that the top of the arm is going to fold over the underarm portion. So this tab here from your band is going to show, and this is the tab that is going to get folded under, okay? So this is going to look like this when we get into construction. So now we need to pay attention to those 3 notches we made and our tailor tacks. So these 2 notches that are closest to the side seam, they represent the pleats. So what you're going to do, there's 1 pleat. So what you're going to do, I'm going to turn the work so that you can see. I'm going to take where my tailor tacks are and where my notches are and pinch the first one and bring it over to the second one. So this way your pleat is folding in the same direction as your cuff. Okay? So you're matching up notch to notch here and tailor tack to tailor tack. You're going to stick a pin in it. There's only 1 pleat in this shirt. A lot of times you'll see 2 and sometimes even 3. You're going to put a tailor tack in this and then just baste it together. And again, I'm teaching you a lot of the finer methods of stitching so that you'll have good habits going forward. So I'm going to kind of stitch that pleat shut, making sure that everything's lined up, the notches and the tailor tack. Okay? So my prep is already at the bottom. The next thing I'm going to do is to prep the top. So what you're going to do here is to find where your notches are, right, for your front and your back, and you're going to run 2 rows of basting right along the crown of your sleeve here. The first row, let's see, we'll have 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So the first row should be about halfway. So that is 5/16 in, so about halfway. So if I'm sewing here at 5/8, I want my first row of basting to go halfway the distance between my seam allowance stitching and my cut edge of my garment. So from the notch around to the notch. Then the second row will go right next to it towards the cut edge. So you're going to have 2 rows of basting. Always, always, always 2 rows of basting. And I'll show you why. Let me go put them in. So I have 2 rows of basting, no back tacking because you need to pull these threads in order to gather up your sleeve. But you can start to see where the stitching is already starting to gather it. So what we're going to be doing is to taking these when we get to it. I don't want you to do it yet, leave it flat. I want you to put them in now because it's easier to put them in than when the sleeve is together. So while the sleeve is flat, put in your 2 rows of basting. Again, no back tacking. And let me zoom in to show you the distance of it so you can see. So here, I measure in 5/8 of an inch. I'll stick a pin in where my stitching goes. So my stitching is going to happen here at 5/8 of an inch. So the distance from this cut edge to this pin here is 5/8 of an inch. And if you can see, my first row of basting is here, which is about halfway between the cut edge and the actual stitching line that will happen. And then half the distance again from your first stitching line to the cut edge. You can see here, I know it's hard because it's white, but I've put another row of stitching. So 2 rows of basting, no back tacking, evenly balanced. So what'll happen is that when we go to pull these to gather them, it's going to give you a really nice sleeve cap and balance it so that it'll go in without any catches in it. But we'll get to the sleeve in a bit. The next thing I'm going to do is to sew the underarm seam. I'm going to let you choose what type of seam finish you would like here. You can just run your 5/8 of an inch seam and then run it through the serger and serge them together. You can also sew your 5/8 inch seam and then serge each of the edges. So again, I'm putting right sides together to make my sleeve underarm seam. So you can stitch it and then run it through the serger on this edge and on the other edge. Or I think what I'm going to do to be consistent with the look, particularly since I have an eyelet, is I'm going to French seam this. So I know you did French seaming last semester with Professor Haregi. So you have a choice here of closing this up. So you can sew 5/8, serge it, you can clean finish this edge, you can serge them individually, and then they're going to get pressed to the back if you end up sewing it together like I will. With the French seam, I'm going to press my seam to the back. So let me go ahead and do that, and we'll come back and take a look at it. Next, we're going to prep the cuff. So what you're going to do is to take your cuff. You don't really need to tailor tack. I think you're going to be fine without. What I do want you to do is to put a little notch where the fold line is, so you can keep track of that. Then what you're going to do, because these are rectangles, so you'll be fine, is on the wrong side of the fabric, so make sure that you take your cuffs, and you know what you're doing here. And on the wrong side of the fabric, you're going to put down your interfacing. Your interfacing at this point should be cut the full size of the pattern. It's much better to trim it back than it is to have too little. So I'm paying attention to my notches here because things can go off. And now what I'm going to do is, with my waxed thread, I'm going to baste well inside the pattern. I guess up here I can go up closer to the fold line because the fold line's not getting stitched. But I'm going to go ahead and baste, and you can take pretty good sized stitches here. They don't have to be small. I'm keeping mine at about healthy 1/2 inch, and I'm going to go and baste all the way around. So I have my interfacing basted to my cuff, and again, because you're not using iron-on, you're going to have a lot more chance to really kind of trim and sculpt this properly. That's why I like it. I don't like the iron-on because once you put it on, you own it. Yes, it is fast, but that's not always a good thing. So what you're going to do, so I have my interfacing basted to the wrong side of my cuff. So I'm going to take my cuff and I'm going to fold it in half. And basically, the cuff is going to go on almost exactly the way the waistband did. Except I'm going to show you another way to do this. We talked about, when we did the waistband, we talked about doing it flat so that you have flexibility to control the fabric. This time what I want you to do is to try it in a different way. So fold it in half, right sides together. I'm going to take the seam allowance here and I'm going to turn it under 5/8 of an inch. And if you have to measure it, you should, because it has to be right. Otherwise, this is going to work. And again, that's why I had you do the waistband the way I did, so that you could be successful at it in learning how to control it. So you can measure it out with your see-through. So there I am at 5/8. You can put a pin in this. Down at the other end, I'm going to do the same thing. Turn it under 5/8. Measure it to make sure it's right. Pin it. And then in the center, I'll do the same thing. It has to be right, otherwise this method doesn't work. Okay? So again, measuring it, 5/8. Putting a pin in it, and try not to use your plastic pins, hopefully your plastic headed pins, because the iron likes to melt those. Okay, so once I have it pinned into place, then I'm going to give it a really good press. So I'm pressing down the 5/8 of an inch before I even start. Now that I have my seam allowance pressed over, I'm going to stitch 5/8 of an inch from the fold over. I'm not going to the top. You don't want to do that. Because you want that piece to be as free as possible. So 5/8 of an inch, back tack here, sew to the bottom, back tack there, and do the same thing on the other side. 5/8 of an inch, back tack, down, back tack. So I've put in my side seams for my cuff. The next thing I'm going to do, let me get my basting out of the way here, is to go in with a nice sharp scissor. I'm going to use my bigger one here, and I'm going to score back my seam allowance so that it's pretty close to the stitching. Get it out of the way so it doesn't get caught too much. So score the interfacing back first, all the way up. And once I have the interfacing scored back, so I've left a healthy 1/8 of an inch there, then I'm going to trim it like I did the waistband. So I'm going to cut off that corner. Be careful you don't get too close. And then trim my seam allowance in half. Oops, get rid of my pins here. Okay, and then what I'll be able to do is to take my cuff and turn it right side out. Use my point turner. Love my point turner, as you well know. Now I have a nice sharp cuff that's nicely interfaced. Okay? And what I have left is 5/8 of an inch that will get stitched on to the shirt, which we'll do in the next. So you're going to do this process on both sides. So now I'll go ahead over and do the same thing here. So I'm going to score back my interfacing and clip my corner off and trim my seam allowance in half, turn it inside out. and then I'll show you how to attach it to the shirt. So now I'm going to sew the right hand side of my cuff to the right hand side of my shirt. So I'm going to start at the front. I'm going to turn that band placket under, and I know that by the pleat that that's my front, and then I'm going to line my shirt up exactly at the end. Now typically what I will do is to let this hang over by like a tiniest bit, just enough to make sure that my cuff is not going to get compromised in the body of my shirt. And again, for this process, I'm going to pin horizontally, which you really don't do. Now I have my basted pleat. My pleat is basted closed, just double checking everything here. See, my interfacing looks a little big. So I'm going to make sure, I forgot to trim my interfacing here. See how it's a little bigger there? I got to fix that. So I'm lining up my fabric. Make sure your interfacing is not extended beyond your cuff. And if it is, I'll trim it off first. So once I get my front pinned and my pleat pinned, I'm going to go to the other end and put the cuff on this, and then I'm going to balance it in between. So I'm pinning each end first and then pinning in between, and then making sure everything's nice and flat and even. So now on this end, don't forget, this is the under collar, the under cuff. So this band is going to be extended out. So this is going to go right over. So the band is not folding over on this side. It's going flat. And again, I'll put my pins in horizontally here. And then I'm going to go ahead and pin where my seam allowance is. Again, I use the French seam allowance, but whatever you used is fine. And now I'm going to go ahead and take my cuff and fit it in. It all should fit in really nicely now, so it'll be nice and flat. And now it'll be easy to get in here and to sew your 5/8. So now I'm going to go in and stitch back tack at the front of my cuff. I'm going to stitch along 5/8 of an inch all the way to the end and back tack here. There's no extension on this. That's where it differs from the waistband. So the two differences are that one is your seam allowance is pressed under to make it easier for you to sew, and the other is that this cuff was going to go end to end with no extension. So let me put the cuff on, and we'll come back and take a look at it. Okay, my cuff is attached. I don't have any catches. Everything seems to be lined up. I check it on both sides. Lined up. I had a little problem with my bobbin there. Lines up perfectly there. That's good. So the next thing I want to do is to score back my interfacing. So you want to get your band out of the way and get in and do the same thing that you did before. This is a little bit more difficult to get in because it's stitched. And then the other thing I want to talk about is, try a smaller scissor here, might be faster. It's a good idea to have an artillery of scissors that do different things. And it's a really good idea to have really good scissors because it really can make the work go a little faster. So I'm going to go in now and trim off. First, I'm scoring back my interfacing to my stitching, and I'll do that all the way around. I'm going to go slowly with this, so I'll be back. Okay, so I've scored back my interfacing. The other thing too that I want to say, if you're working on a home machine, you probably noticed that when you went to sew, that it's hard because you're sewing in a circle and the circle is small. If you have a home machine that has a drop arm, this is a sample of a drop arm. So you can see here, if you look around the throat plate, see how that piece that's on the side has been removed. So there's usually a button in the back that helps to kind of pop it open. And now this is really good to know, particularly for sleeves and even if you're interested in children's wear, a drop arm is really great because now you can slide, just imagine that you have your cuff and you can slide it in around that bar that's now extended to be able to stitch much more easily than when you're stitching flat. So now what I'm going to do is to trim away my seam allowance. So, careful that nothing is always a little fearful. So I'm going to cut it again in half. Sorry. So that the seam allowance is actually cut back less than your actual interfacing. I'm going to cut it back, and then it's going to be time for a press, and wait until you see how nice and easily this goes in. Cut this in half, this out of the way, and you're going to notice it's going to get a little lumpy where your band is. Okay. So turn your shirt inside out, and then I'm going to use my sleeve board here because it's a little easier for me to show you. And then what you're going to do is, so my shirt's inside out, I'm going to press my interfacing towards my cuff, my seam towards my cuff. You can get in and pull all those tacking and basting out later. But I'm going to press my shirt body towards my cuff, keeping the cuff out of the way, the cuff turn under out of the way. And this is a good place for you to now give that pleat a little press. Pleat that we tacked down a while ago, you can give that a little press. And now, once you have it pressed, now you can see that you can tuck this underneath. That's why you can't be careful you don't cut too closely. And now I'm going to go in and hand stitched like I did with the waistband. I'm going to bury my knot, and I'm going to pick up my stitches along my seam line and pick up the edge of the cuff. And you'll see it's going to be nice and finished all the way around. That should line up perfectly at this point, and then a good press, and you're there. So let me get a needle and thread, and show you how to attach the cuff just as a refresher. I can take this out now. And we'll give a good press, and that's your cuff. Then you can get rid of your basting too. Okay, single thread only. Thread is waxed. What I'm going to do is to get in here, and I call it burying my knot. So that I'm going to come out at the end, And my knot's going to be buried inside, so hopefully it will give me now what I'm going to do here, I don't have to be too fussy. Here I don't have to pick up the threads. Here I can actually pick up from the band. And you may want to find, but you do want to pick up just the edge. I know a lot of you went a little too deep on your fabric the last time. You can pin this closed if it's easier for you. Stick a pin in here just to hold it in line. And now I'm going to go ahead where I'm getting in the shirt. I'm going to pick up the thread that I used to attach the cuff to the shirt, and I'm going to pick up the edge of the cuff. And so your stitches should be no more than 1/4 of an inch. You can use your needle to help you tack down there. Here. So I'm just picking up the tiniest bit. And again, this is where the waxed thread really helps. Picking up the thread. I'm picking up a little of the seam allowance too. What you don't want to do is to pick up the body of the shirt. You want to make sure that you stay away from that because you don't want it to show. We're going to go back, we're going to add some top stitching to this in a minute, but first we're going to get it so that it's nice, and again about 1/4 of an inch apart. Each stitch should be about 1/4 of an inch apart, and again don't go too deeply in, keep it as close as you can, but you're picking up a thread, here's a better example, and then picking up the edge. Okay, I'm going to do that all the way to the end. And there's my cuff completed. This is the inside of the garment, so I can take my sleeve now and turn it right side out. And there you go, my seam is nice and pressed. Again, I did a French seam because it was more conducive with what was going on with the rest of the garment. So my last step here is going to be to keep the cuff in line with the garment. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch along the edge. I'm going to top stitch along the edge. And I'm thinking on the cuff I will run 2 rows of top stitching. So now that becomes a decorative stitch. So when we did the flat fell and we had the 2 double stitching, that was really functional as well as decorative. With this now, this is really completely decorative. It will help to keep this tacked down also, but so that's up to you if you want to. But I do recommend at least 1 row of stitching. If you do 1 row of stitching, it always goes on the edge, not on the inside, okay? And that's the sleeve, so the next part will be to set the sleeve into the body. We'll do that next.